All right, we're going to move east and start. I wanted just to spend just a little bit of time on some of these modules. So this one and the next one on the Americas, talking about um, what's going on with other cultures. I think it's very important to include them in the conversation with this course. Um, it's not typical for a survey course to have this, only because there's always a focus on Western art. And there's a lot to cover. But that being said, I want to make some mention of some of these things because there's a lot of crossover. Also, I am no expert in these areas specifically, and so I will go over them very briefly because there's a lot to cover. Also, once again, each of these could be a semester long. There's some really beautiful things that are happening within each of these cultures, but there's still a lot of things, especially on earlier cultures, that we just don't know. That still being said, we're covering time periods that are up till about the 1450s. So we're not getting into a lot of modern looks. So if you see some things that aren't on here, it's probably because we're still kind of taking an earlier look. And if you want the later look, then that'd be in the second part of this course in the following semester. So that being said, I'm just going to try to do the best I can to give you the pieces that are the most predominant within Asia. Most of this we've already covered, but really when you think of, we started in Mesopotamia, which is about in dead center, and we've worked our way to the west, and now we're going to go back to Mesopotamia and then launch our way back east. Okay, and one of the earliest is the Indus Valley civilization, early India. So we're going to be in India, then we'll move into China and Korea and Japan and such. But right now we're focused on India, and India. This site at Mohenjo-Daro is a really amazing site, and there's artifacts and things that are found, but not in mass abundance, which is very surprising because the city itself shows a lot of modern amenities. And so I give you the YouTube link there, but it's interesting in a city that shows that they had controlled plumbing, like indoor toilets and way of controlling sewage and all that, and these massive pools, that we see these massive urban settlements. But when we look at history after that, they're all rural. So there's a reversal. Instead of a rural to urban shift, we're seeing an urban to rural shift. That's what's really interesting about this, that leads us to believe that there must be something else that's going on, but it's not really documented, so it's kind of, we're guessing. But a lot of what we find is something down here in the lower right, and this is a seal that would have been pressed into wax because this is a major trading civilization. And so what we have is this interesting figure, thought to maybe be a three-faced man. We see a face left, there's the nose in the center, and then to the right, and the eye, but also can be an eye on the side. In this yoga sort of pose, we see animals around, and then we have this almost cuneiform-like writing up in the top. This seal was a wax seal that would have been stamped onto the band of the goods being delivered. And we see a lot of this trade and these seals not only there, but in the Mesopotamian area. So you would break that seal, of course, when you open up, this being the actual clay that would have been pressed into it. So it's a really interesting, not only iconographically, that maybe shows a little bit whether it is a yoga pose or not. That would be very interesting into what's happening in the culture. But then also, their main form of commerce. I briefly talk about this. It's covered more in your book, but the Vedas and the Upanishads, at this time, this is a very early sort of religious organization, and how this will eventually lead to ideas on Buddhism and Hinduism. And Hinduism is still the most dominant religion in India today, and it has a pantheon of 33 million gods, I believe, and it's and their architecture and the features are going to be decorated with that. Buddhism is founded by Siddhartha Gautama, and I put in there, if you want more on the Buddha, This is not one that I have on the Moodle shell, but if you're interested, you can check this out. It's a longer series, but it really goes into the detail of his life and how he removed himself from being a prince. He left his wife and his kid and went to answer the question of, why is there suffering in the world, and how do we solve that problem? And he jumps around with different ideas and beliefs. There was many different sort of sects of how to obtain enlightenment, and so he would go and study under people. He would even, at one point, he was starving himself, where he's only eating 1 grain of rice a day, sleeping in uncomfortable places. That's where the whole sleeping on a bed of nails would come in. So you're tormenting your body. There's some believe that that's the way that you can remove yourself and have no pain. So anyway, he goes through a lot of stuff before he finds this achievement of nirvana. And so if you're interested in more in that, you can check out that film. But Siddhartha Gautama is the founder of Buddhism, and this is in India, and he does find followers. However, it doesn't really stick as much. It's amazing how China will pick that up, and we'll talk about that in a second. But Buddhist architecture, just like any religion, after there's the religion, there's organized, there's sort of a structure that's created. Unlike Christianity or Islam or Judaism, though, Buddhism, this architecture is not built as a place of worship when we think of like going to church. These were originally built to house relics of the Buddha. So when he died, his body was, I believe, originally divided into 5 pieces, and there was and each placed inside a stupa. And the stupa is a ceremonial mound, right? And this idea of like achieving enlightenment through continually going up and down. There's sort of a passage where there's many paths, but they all lead to the top, right? That's kind of like the idea of within the architecture here. But you would be able to enter through this gate. This gate itself would have carvings of the different previous lives of the Buddha. And so there sometimes him as an animal, a butterfly, things like that. It also sometimes have little areas of that would show important places or teachings from him, but it never shows him in a human form. The idea is that when you entered this, you would walk around the outside in sort of this gated area here, or closed-in area here. You would walk around this this mound, saying your prayers. Some have sometimes even chanting. There's a lots going on, but this is based off of a two-dimensional form of, or this is three-dimensional form of the two-dimensional form of a mandala. So if we flip this and looked at it from the air, we would have a very similar look. And so there's the terms that you'll need to know there: the Dharana, the harmonica, the yasti, and the yasti is the pole, right? And the chatras are the 3 discs on top, right? And these are sort of like the way, like a portal, once again, pointing to the heaven, to that space above. Not that they believe in heaven, but it's that idea of transcendence. This is a little bit more close up of one of those gates, all those carvings in the previous lives of the Buddha. Other forms that these have taken is they're carved directly into the stone walls, and so this is looking inside of a cave. Really, all this is carved out of stone. It's not stone brought in; it's the cave itself. And so this gives you sort of an idea of scale and walking in. And so stupas themselves later on, as the thing goes, that as Buddhism became a little bit more popular, the stupas, the original 5, were reopened and divided again. And I don't know if stupas still contain, all of them still contain some relic of a Buddha. I'm not sure about that, but like in this case, we have it carved out of stone, the stupa, and it's small in scale, but you still can walk around it. And that's sort of the main idea. Now we have what I really want you to know are what called Lakshana. Lakshana are symbols of the Buddha. And so when we get these carvings and these images, we know that it's supposed to represent a Buddha by some very specific features. Now, there are 32 of these Lakshana marks. It's not that every sculpture contains all of them. And so I've listed a few of them here. What we notice is that this cranial bump, like sometimes we think, oh, that's a top knot. It's actually not. It's not hair. It's meant to be sort of like this larger bump, sort of like an endowment that says, like, yes, this is the Buddha. This is somebody who has a spiritual blessing. We have the mudras, the hand gestures, which sometimes the hand is up or sideways and stuff. Each one has different elongated ears. There's sometimes a spinning wheel on the imprint of the feet or the soles of or the palms or soles of the feet. Urna or a curl. Sometimes we'll see like a curl of hair that comes here. So there's a lot of different identifiers. All right, on this next slide, we're going to talk about Hindu architecture. So Hindu architecture is, a lot of it has been lost due to just time, materials used to construct it. But really I want to just focus on the three main types of Hindu temples. In the north, they're called Nagara. They're noticeable for their beehive-like shape. And in the south, they're called the Dravida. Sometimes they're, when we look at them, you'll be able to sort of stylistically pick them apart, because that one has a little bit straighter pyramid-like structure, and then there's a sort of a mix, a hybrid called the Visara. So, looking at these, you can definitely sort of see the differences, right? And in the Visara easily, where they're kind of combined in structure. The Nagara itself has a little bit more curvilinear. The Dravida is very much like that step temple that we've seen used culturally before, and sort of the blending of the two there. It has a lot of similar features as a Buddhist stupa would, and but really these temples are built to house a god, and the idea is that that is sort of the living place of the god. So that's where I would say that they really differ the most, is that these are places that they go, and you go inside and there is a shrine, a statue or so where the god is housed and worshipped there. Now, we're already leaping into China, and the reason why is that because Buddhism isn't really adopted as strong in India, but in China it takes off and becomes very quickly the religion of choice. What's very interesting about China is that it was many separate states, and then they're all brought together with Emperor Qin, and when he takes over, it's actually, that was sort of like, he was almost like a King Arthur legend, I guess is the best way to put it. And I want you to watch on Canopy that there are what's called the Emperor's Army, or any of the Terracotta Warrior films, because a lot of things had been given up to superstition until these terracotta warriors were originally found. And it was in 1974, a farmer digging a well and comes across a face, and another, and soon they realize that they kind of have this find. So archaeologists come in, and sure enough, they found thousands of these. What's very interesting is that and you can see on the image on the right, is that the figures have been found, and they would have been fully equipped with actual weapons. Those, of course, have deteriorated over time, so there's a lot of like arrowheads, spearheads, and things just on the ground around what would have been like a wooden shaft or so. But every warrior has a personality, a different face. So you can imagine that the army itself was actually duplicated in many ways. And this is at the foot of what was always thought to be sort of a mountain, but is now believed to be the tomb of Emperor Qin, so the one who united China. What's really amazing is that by unifying China, he made an official language, coinage,
was able to. It had to be done by force, but at the same time, like it's what brought everybody together. So built the Great Wall, standardized the written language. It's really amazing all that he did that kind of really set the groundwork for what we even know as China today. And Chinese pottery also has a very strong tradition. The earliest pots that they found prehistoric wise come out of China. And they aren't the typical Chinese vases that we think of with the porcelain and the blue glazes and stuff, but they're earthenware, and this is a type of clay that can be fired in a kiln at very low temperature, so you can imagine why it's so popular to use. But because of this, we know that they're developing kilns, and they were even able to fire clay up to 2,000 degrees because we know what it takes to fire this clay. So that right there already gives you an idea of what technologies they had. And what's also very amazing is that we have these perfect forms, or what seemingly are perfect forms, all created by hand. Now we find a lot of bronze and jade artifacts. Bronze, we've looked at already techniques that were from lost wax casting. So we've seen that before, and this technique is called hollow casting. So knowing how to do that to create a lighter weight pour, so that way you're not just having such heavy objects, is really pretty amazing. But then I really like the idea of this jade and that lower left hand piece. You look at it and you're like, all right, well, that's interesting. But what's very interesting about this is that this stone is so hard that it can't be cut with just any ordinary tools. And what they found is that they would use sand in bamboo strands, like a cord. You make something like what would be like a cord, like a necklace, and that whole thing would be coated in sand and then rubbed over the surface to cut in and through it. So it takes a long time to do this, and it's like sanding through a 2x4 in order to cut it instead of just cutting it with the blade. You'd have to sand that out. It does take some time and some technology. So. Now, one of the most prolific that we see is Chinese painting. We know that the Silk Road was around, and this went all the way into Rome. This opened up a lot of trade routes. So there's a lot of wonderful examples that still survive that have been spread across the world because of their trade. But silk was sort of a national treasure. It wasn't known. There's even accounts, even Marco Polo himself, when trying to smuggle out a silkworm. The idea of what's the secret, but it was kept very quiet. And I put in here what's cool about Chinese painting is they actually developed one of the earliest standards or canons of painting that we know about, and that is and the 6 that are listed there. And I find this to be really amazing that when you've already sort of put in guidelines, it's very much like Egyptian art where, the standards don't change for thousands of years to say this is how good art is made. This is what we deem beautiful. This is what we think is the highest form that represents us. So here's sort of an example, some early Chinese painting. Because of silk is a great material to work on. If the pigments have good binders in them, then they will stick to the surface, and it can be rolled up. It can last a long time. Silk isn't just going to deteriorate like when we think of something like papyrus or even just regular paper. So now getting back to Buddhism and the spread in China, when it comes through, it spreads very quickly. And with Buddhism, we're going to look at how things iconographically stay the same when representing Buddhism in another culture and how they differ. So we're going to look at some of these symbols. Now, architecture-wise, usually civilizations, they use what they have and also some of the sort of skills they have. So Buddhism, it stayed around as the emperors came and went, which is a really important thing. It wasn't outlawed and came back, right? Like we see with Christianity. But in the Tang Dynasty, a great amount of time was put into the creation of works. So we can see that there must have been more of a wide acceptance over that. And so here's an example here, and I provide a link that gives you more information about it. but all this is hewn directly into the stone, which is very similar though how you're saying that the stupas created in India where they were carving into caves. So you can see that tradition is sticking around. Now, one thing that is definitely different is the Chinese pagoda and being made out of wood. Now, this is very reminiscent to the stupa when we think of, okay, a small structure, but that yasti, right, that center pole with those stones that would have marked it. Now, those actually still exist up here, but the whole structure itself seems to follow that same form. And this is the tallest wooden structure in the world. It's really amazing how these are put together as far as their how they can support weight with such timbers. And a lot of them, too, they don't have nails at this time. So a lot of things are put together by fitting the wood, peg, mortise and tenon, things like that. So very, very amazing. But like stupa, the pagoda would house relics and sacred images and texts. So it still is a place of worship. And the YouTube link there will give you even more. Now, Japan has some very interesting history that it dates pretty far back, and what it also does is gives us really two looks at Japan. So we're going to look at the earliest people of Japan and some of the earliest known ceramic pieces that remain from them. They're known as the hamon, which means cord making, referring to sort of this like coil. We see all the way the coil sort of rope around and such to make those sort of cords. And so that decoration is also in the earthenware pottery. These people sort of, I don't want to use the term like just went away, but they definitely were absorbed as people came over from China and Korea and sort of settled Japan. So everybody's kind of moving a little bit more and more east. So that's why a lot of the traditions came about. There's some videos that I posted on Moodle about this. It gives even a greater synopsis if you're really interested in this time period. So from the Hamon, we go to the Yayoi culture, and this is in present-day Tokyo. So the oldest of Japanese towns. It's not as traditional as Kyoto, but what's really kind of cool is they produce these large bells, and these bells themselves, though, they have this decoration, all this, but they're not used for like ringing bells like you think. Like they must have been something more ceremonial about them, but they were not musical instruments. They do know that. They do have the first images, pictorial images that they find in Japan, but amazing, and these things are huge. So I know this one doesn't show the best proportion, but very interesting that once again in a prehistoric culture, they create something that doesn't have a direct function that we can find. So it's kind of like when I was talking to the prehistoric, like why would you paint in the darkest areas of the cave? It doesn't make much sense. Or why even paint at all when you're trying just to find food? Same sort of here. You're using a lot of resources to create something that's very specific. So that's where it probably goes to more ceremonial purposes. Now, the other of the third, the last of these older cultures, the Kofun culture, and meaning old tomb. They call them that because of the tombs that they left. These tumuli are these like key-shaped mounds that are surrounded by a moat, and then another sort of like gardening. And what's really cool is that these still have not been opened up. There's huge debate. Some would love to just go in there and try to find more about their culture, but others really regard the dead and honor that. And so what you're looking at here is a man-made burial mound. So this earth would have been dug out in this key shape and piled here to make it even larger. Now what we don't see, because all the vegetation around it, is that there's actually more of a mountain here, and it sort of slopes down. Now there are surrounding this hundreds to even thousands of what are called haniwa, and these are clay sculptures They range from human form to warriors, animals, and such, and they are all over in here, and they're supposed to guard, um, uh, both in a spiritual sense and a physical sense, anything from happening to these. Now, there are several of these all over, in this particular area. And check out the YouTube video. It's very interesting, but there's always a debate. Should we do it? Should we open it? Are there treasures in there? But they're still closed off. Now, before Buddhism comes into Japan, the main sort of idea was this belief called Shinto, or way of the gods. And Shinto is really kind of interesting because these structures are built, and you can see in the top right the outside, and of course the inside of that structure in the bottom right. And they were built really around sort of the idea of a harvest and a harvest festival. But it's not like a church, and it's not really like a religion. There are no priests of it. There's no sort of like organization of it. It just is sort of this focus on nature, and they would pray to gods. Um, but these shrines that you see are very temporary. They only last 20 years, and then they take it all down and they rebuild it. So that's why it's sometimes so hard to know what and why the stuff is done the way it is, because we don't have any original examples to say, was there an evolution with it? Whether there used to be writing? Why is it so minimalistic? That sort of thing. But they're very temporary. And so, like I said, it's every 20 years they're removed. But once Buddhism hits Japan, its influence is very strong, similar like China and Korea, and we have now a sort of another level of Buddhist image making. So I put in there a Bushi, which means the maker of Buddhist images. This is kind of interesting because people would take on the last name of the tasks that they would do in everyday life. And so you would be, so and so, the teacher, or, like your occupation would be part of your name. And so we're going to get into more of the iconography of them, but you can see already. So we're still using those Lakshana, right? We still see the top knot, right? We still see the sun or eternal flame. It's just a little bit of the stylization that changes. The face and the proportions sometimes go from round to even straighter, to maybe even represent more of what they feel like they look like. So architecture is also very same in Chinese to like the pagoda. Wood is the primary source in this, and what you're looking at is the Great Buddha Hall. So this is sort of a stupa in its own right. It's not as tall or sort of elaborate as the Chinese would have had, but inside of here would be this massive, we don't see it here, but is a massive Buddha. In fact, the building is built around it. And so, unfortunately, the original structure was destroyed in an earthquake and then rebuilt in sort of a smaller fashion. So this is what we have going out. But from the stupa in India to this here, this is sort of the breadth of the evolution of that architecture. This slide specifically is talking more about like mandalas and sort of the different sects that there are, the two main of Buddhism. And the video link is going to give you even more if you're interested in Buddhism and sort of the two veins that develop of it. And this is a really early silk painting of that. And Buddhism influenced just even the sort of the regular architecture of the day. This is called Phoenix Hall, and it's in Kyoto, and it's one of the oldest still of early Japanese architecture. A lot has changed as the country has grown and evolved and been more modern, but it's meant to be sort of like the modeled after a phoenix or flightless bird, or sorry, not flightless, but the bird that can sort of rebirth itself. So we have these wings that come out. It's symmetrical, right? We have a reflecting space. We have this horizon, and with that, there's like a constant duality. There's not only symmetry on the horizon, but also on the vertical axis. So it has some religious sort of or spiritual nature to it, harmony in that regard. Um, Early art, we talked about like the Epic of Gilgamesh with the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. And I put this out. If you're really interested in Japanese art, you should look at the Tale of Genji. And a lot of images and really illustrations come out of this. Um, we see a lot of early woodblock prints. Woodblock prints are very synonymous with Japanese art. And as they continue to be worked and evolve, they become one of the main images that later even inspire the Impressionists. So without Japanese and early Japanese woodblocks, we wouldn't have that idea of how to invoke space on sort of this flattening of a two-dimensional surface. What we see here, we see the illusion of space, but everything's very flat color, but yet still has sort of a life, and the Impressionists really pick up on that. We talk. I throw this period in there because all of a sudden we see sort of the shogun, the military sort of leader, come to the forefront, and really things start to change as Japan. Not only is there's more fighting, but I think just sort of their entire lifestyle is changing a little bit more. And what we see are these portrait carvings, and we see a very strong sense of realism come about. A lot of this could be the influence from artists that and the exchange from east to west. But this is one of the most famous portraits of a monk, and it's really interesting because it would not only do you get a strong sense of realism, but they would have inlaid rock crystals in the eyes, and they would go through a lot of effort of portraying an individual that we hadn't seen before. These are all the earliest forms of Japanese art. Like there is a lot more that we know of contemporary. The same with Chinese and India and the art. So I'm showing you the earliest of early pieces. Like I said, up before 1450. So before we had a lot of modernization going on. These are the pieces that have survived the test of time. So that's really the piece that I want you to focus on this chapter. But know that once again, I'm really doing a quick one over of trying to cover everything that I can within this unit. We'll cover the Americas next in a similar fashion, and I just highly suggest using videos as your resources to help fill in those gaps from your reading in the book and the notes that I'm giving